Hello, everyone. Just want to let you know as you file in, you are in the right place. Just going to allow about another minute or so for everyone to get settled in, but we thank you for joining us today. Once again, want to welcome everyone to today's webcast. Going to let things settle in for another 30 seconds and get the presentation going then. We thank you for joining us. Well, an official hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. Here's to Workplace Safety, How to Create a Sound Hearing Conservation Program, sponsored by J.J. Keller. My name is Kevin Drewley. I'm an associate editor with Safety and Health Magazine and will be moderating today's session. Thanks for joining us. In a few minutes, we'll start a presentation, but first, let's review some preliminary items. The views of today's speakers and organizations are their own and may not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not necessarily mean the council or magazine endorses those items. At the end of today's webcast, we'll conduct a question and answer session. To ask a question, simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question, and click the send button. Feel free to ask your question at any time during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the question and answer session to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but because of the large number of participants today, we might not get to every question. Any unanswered questions will be forwarded along to today's speakers. At the end of the webcast, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey. We'll let you know more about that after the presentation. This webcast will be archived, so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, please visit safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. With that, let's go ahead and get started. Our speakers today are Cindy Pauly and Gina Godine, who both serve as EHS editors at J.J. Keller. Cindy brings 13 years of safety program development and management experience in multiple industries, including oil and gas, chemical, manufacturing, construction, and agricultural. Cindy develops a variety of easily understandable content and provides regulatory insight for J.J. Keller's customers and partners. Gina has 10 years of hands-on experience as a safety manager in the construction, mining, and manufacturing industries. She frequently writes about topics including lockout-tagout, personal protective equipment, confined spaces, and working at height. Again, we thank you all for tuning into this presentation. Cindy, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Kevin. We really appreciate that. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We know your time is valuable, but we're certainly glad that you chose to spend that with us today. Just before we get going, I wanted to mention that today's webcast is made possible by the all-new J.J. Keller Compliance Network. This compliance network offers a wide range of tools and resources that are hopefully going to help your businesses keep up with those constantly changing OSHA regulations and other regulations, but also expand your compliance knowledge on topics that are important to you guys. Features include things like compliance resources, news and trending issues, consulting directly with our experts, peer discussion forums, even like blogs, and so much more. So on behalf of J.J. Keller's Compliance Network, again, thank you all for joining us. Would like to start off with just a little statistic here. Have you heard that nearly 22 million workers are exposed to potentially damaging noise at work? This is every single year. This is industries as diverse as manufacturing, construction, even sports venues, airports, things that we don't even think of sometimes. And it's an astounding number if you think about it. But the good news is that hearing loss is preventable. So this webcast is going to take a look at your responsibilities around hearing conservation, as well as occupational noise in the workplace. We've got a lot to cover today, so we're going to go relatively quickly. And so with that, Gina, how about you let us know what we're going to cover today?
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Cindy. So let's take a look at what we're going to be talking about today. First, we'll discuss the requirements for implementing a hearing conservation program. We'll also talk about noise monitoring and control measures and some basics surrounding audiometric testing and medical evaluations. We'll also chat about various hearing protective devices and how noise reduction ratings factor in. And then finally, we'll share some training and OSHA reporting and record keeping requirements. Now, as we proceed through the presentation, if you have any questions on this topic, please put them in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to as many of them as time permits at the end of the webcast. So we recognize that this presentation has a lot of information, some of which gets technical. So to make things a bit easier, we'd like to share some commonly used acronyms that will pop up throughout the presentation. So from here, we'll use these acronyms that you see on your screen. Now, we'd like to know a little bit about you, and I believe Cindy has a poll question for us. Cindy, do you have that?
I do. Thanks, Gina. So you're going to see on your screen now, we're just kind of curious how your safety program, how your current program addresses occupational noise. So do you perform regular sound surveys and risk assessments to determine where the protection is required and testing and things like that? Have you performed some risk assessments, but you maybe haven't performed sound surveys or noise surveys? Are you ready to start your hearing conservation program, perhaps, and you want to learn a little bit more? Or maybe you've just joined us today and you're unsure and you just want to better understand what those requirements are. So we'll give you a few seconds if you want to go ahead and take a look at those and choose. But while we're waiting, I would like to address just one question that we often get from folks, and that is, how many employees must you have before being required to implement a hearing conservation program? Good question, since there's a lot of numbers associated with like your OSHA logs and things like that being 10 or under. But when it comes to hearing conservation, you really only need one employee that has occupational exposure to those decibels of 85 decibels or more over that 8-hour time weighted average. And you'll hear that a little bit more as we proceed. So really good question there, but only one employee that's exposed is enough to have a program. So looks like we get some answers coming in here. Most everybody, looks like a third of folks are already performing sound surveys and risk assessments. So those are really, really good results. And I'm glad that those that are unsure are here to better understand those requirements. So thank you all for sharing that with us. I did want to share a few more statistics. Yep, I'm kind of a little bit of a statistics geek, I guess you would say. As you can see on your screen here, these are from both NIOSH and the CDC. We're not going to go through all of them, but I want to point out that one that I bulleted here in the middle. You can see that 53% of workers report not wearing their hearing protection, or some of them might even not be wearing it properly or may not realize they're not wearing it properly, but that's half of the workers, right? So just something to keep in mind. That's over half of employees that aren't wearing hearing protection. So as a byproduct of industrial processes, noise, or what's considered unwanted sound, that's the technical definition of noise. That's one of the most pervasive occupational health issues that the employers must tackle. Exposure to high level of noise causes hearing loss, and it may cause other harmful health effects like loss of balance or dizziness that we don't often think of unless you have issues with your ears. So the extent of damage really depends primarily on the intensity of the noise as well as the duration of the exposure. And that's why that 8-hour time weighted average that we talked about will come into effect. So we're going to dive into this a little bit later in the webcast, but before that, I think Gina's going to take us through some requirements around the actual hearing conservation program. Gina, back to you.
Yes, thank you, Cindy. So when do you need to implement a hearing conservation program? Well, this is where some people get a little bit hung up on the numbers, but don't worry, we will try to break it down into bite-sized pieces for you today. So first, let's talk about the program itself. Now, remember, the intent of OSHA's occupational noise exposure standard is to protect workers with significant occupational noise exposures from hearing loss or hearing impairment. Now, to meet that goal, your hearing conservation program, or HCP, will have components for noise monitoring, hearing tests, exposure controls, training, and documentation. Now, as with any successful program, your hearing conservation program should have a follow-up evaluation process to verify that what you're doing is actually working. So let's go through these individually so that you have a better idea of what's expected for each. So let's start with noise monitoring. The requirements are found in 1910.95 and are really your baseline assessment to determine if you have noise at actionable levels, where the noise is, and what protections are required. Now, I just mentioned actionable levels. So this brings up a question we get often from clients. What is the difference between an action level and a permissible exposure level? To put it in simple terms, the action level, or AL, is a concentration designated for a specific substance, and it's calculated as an 8-hour time-weighted average, which initiates certain required activities, often like exposure monitoring and medical surveillance in some cases. So on the other hand, a permissible exposure level, or PEL, is the highest level of exposure that an employee may be exposed to without incurring the risk of adverse health effects. The action level will always be lower than the permissible exposure level, since action levels are generally set at 1/2 of the PEL. So back to monitoring, it's not necessary for every employer to measure workplace noise, but OSHA requires employers to monitor noise exposure levels to identify when employees are exposed to noise at or above 85 decibels, again, averaged over 8 working hours, or what you'll commonly hear referred to as an 8-hour time-weighted average. Now, keep in mind, this includes all employees whose noise exposure is equivalent to or greater than a noise exposure received in 8 hours, where the noise level is continuously at 85 decibels. So you must monitor and account for all continuous, intermittent, and impulsive noise with an 80 decibel to 130 decibel range that may affect the time-weighted average. Noise monitoring must be performed during a typical work situation. OSHA's requirement is performance orientated, so it allows employers to choose the monitoring method that best suits each individual situation. Now, periodic monitoring is required anytime there are changes in production, a process, or controls that may potentially increase the noise exposure. So some employers implement a schedule for periodic monitoring so they can maintain focus on any changes in noise exposures. Now, these changes may mean that more employees need to be included in the program, or that their hearing protectors may no longer provide adequate protection and may need to be upgraded. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you may find that engineering controls that you've recently implemented allow for removing hearing protection as a requirement. So let's take a look at how 85 decibels compares to ordinary daily noise. Here are some examples of how quickly noise reaches hazard levels. Now, as you can see, normal conversation is shown here on the slide at about 60 decibels. Washing machines, dishwashers, that sort of thing is at about 70. A motorcycle is at about 95 decibels. Now, noise above 70 decibels over a prolonged period of time may start to damage your hearing. Loud noise above 120 decibels can cause immediate harm to your ears. Now, in addition to hearing loss, excessive noise can cause you to miss hearing important warnings or instructions, which can definitely be critical in the workplace. It can cause fatigue from the strain of talking and listening over the noise. It can cause increased blood pressure, headaches, or even other health issues. So ultimately, workplace noise and hearing loss can reduce employees' awareness of what's going on around them and contribute to serious workplace injuries. Now, what exactly is going on at these higher noise levels? Well, damage is occurring to the cilia, or the hair, and the nerve cells in the inner ear. Now, because of the damage, most types of hearing loss cannot be reversed. Noise-induced hearing loss can be temporary or it can be permanent. Now, temporary hearing loss results from short-term exposures to noise, with normal hearing returning after a period of rest. Generally, prolonged exposure to high noise levels over time eventually causes permanent damage. Now, regardless of the loss being temporary or permanent, when we're exposed to loud noises, our inner ears and the small hair-like nerve cells, or cilia, they change or die. So loud noises, especially over time, can cause irreversible damage to the inner ear structures. Now, Cindy, what are some things that we can look for to know if we need to hone in on noise in the workplace?
Great question, Gina. So before I want to go in that, I was glad you covered all that stuff, because I wanted to throw out there too, keep in mind your workers that are in vehicles. From my emergency services experience, it was definitely a problem that we had to watch for with law enforcement, or paramedics are a good example, or truck drivers that have their left window open, so that extra noise from the wind and sirens and things like that causes damage on one ear. So that might be another area just to focus on, but we'll dive into some of those other issues here. So as you can see on the slide, for example, there are a few things that point to high noise levels in the workplace. Things like and probably the most common informal test is that if you need to raise your voice to talk to somebody that's only 3 feet away, or if you have ringing or humming in your ears when you leave work or you're on a lunch break in a quiet area, if that ringing's still there, if you have to shout to be heard by a coworker who's only arm's length away, maybe you experience temporary hearing loss when you leave work, things like that. These are all just good signs that there should be some monitoring of noise levels. Employees are entitled to observe any monitoring procedures that you do, and they must receive notification of the results of that monitoring. So keep that in mind. You need to communicate with your workers. OSHA leaves the method of notification up to you, up to your discretion. But employers are also charged with ensuring instruments are properly calibrated, so the most accurate measurements are taken. Excuse me, sorry about that. But because calibration procedures are unique to specific instruments, employers really should follow the manufacturer's instructions to determine when and how extensively they need to be calibrated. So that is kind of individual based on the equipment you're using. So I do want to talk a little bit more about that equipment. Basically, there are two different instruments that are used to measure noise exposure, the sound level meter and the dosimeter. The sound level meter is a device that measures the intensity of a sound at a given moment. Since sound level meters provide a measure of sound intensity at only one specific point in time, it's generally necessary to take a number of measurements at different times during the day to estimate noise exposures over the entire workday. Because if noise levels fluctuate, the amount of time the noise remains at each of the various measured levels has to be determined. So there's a little bit more fluctuation with those. Now, to estimate employee noise exposures with the sound level meter, it's also generally necessary to take several measurements at different locations within the workplace. So different times, different locations. After appropriate sound readings are obtained, then you can draw somewhat of a map of the sound levels within different areas of the workplace to get a better overall idea of what you have. Now, by using a sound level map and information on employee locations throughout the day, estimates of individual exposure levels can be more clearly developed. The measurement method is generally referred to as area noise monitoring because of the fluctuation. On the other hand, the dosimeter, it's kind of like a sound level meter, except that it stores sound level measurements and integrates these over time. So this provides an average noise exposure reading for a given period of time, like that 8-hour time-weighted workday that we're talking about. With a dosimeter, a microphone is typically attached to the employee's clothing, usually up near as close to their hearing area, their ear, so up by the collarbone usually. And the exposure measurement is simply read at the end of the desired time period. Now, some people might do this, during lunch, starting at lunch through the end of the day, and then picking up the next shift just to get a variety, things like that. So, but a lot of people start the beginning of the day and just carry the monitor through the day. A reader may be used to read out the dosimeter's measurements. Since the dosimeter is worn by the employee, it measures noise levels in those locations in which the employee travels, right? So this meter can also be positioned within the immediate vicinity of the exposed worker to obtain an individual exposure estimate. Again, the closer you're going to get to the real life scenario, the better your measurements are going to be. Area monitoring can be used to estimate noise exposure when noise levels are relatively constant and employees are not mobile. In workplaces where employees move about in different areas or where the noise intensity tends to fluctuate over time, noise exposure is generally more accurately estimated by the personal monitoring approach. So that's why you'll see those monitors attached to people. Now, in situations where personal monitoring is appropriate, proper positioning, like I mentioned, is vital for that. So the microphone, like I said, generally positioned at the shoulder, remains in that position for the entire workday. With a sound level meter, the microphone is stationed near the employee's head, and the instrument is usually held by an individual who follows the employee around as they move about. So sometimes those are a little bit more resource heavy as well, because you need two people. Manufacturer's instructions should be followed for calibration and maintenance on these pieces of equipment, because you want to make sure the most accurate results are being counted. And it's considered good professional practice to calibrate instruments before and after each use. Now, I'm going to hand things back over to Gina for some information on where to get a hold of these pieces of equipment. Gina?
Yeah, good question. So noise monitoring equipment can either be purchased or rented. Smaller companies may find it more economical to rent equipment rather than to purchase it. In addition, some audiological testing firms and industrial hygiene firms, they can also provide noise monitoring services. But another creative solution is that you may find that universities with an audiology, industrial hygiene, or acoustical engineering department, a lot of times they may be willing to provide information. They might be willing to come to your site and offer those services for you. Now, when it comes to calculating employee noise exposure, you can find more information in Appendix A of the 1910.95 standard. And in there, it really walks you through the equations to use for calculation. So while we're on the topic of noise monitoring resources, we wanted to point out that NIOSH has an app that can quickly monitor sound levels. It's a great tool, and I have actually used this in the past in construction and manufacturing work environments. And I think that Cindy has actually used it around the house as well.
I have.
I think she's said that she's checked noise levels of what your lawnmower, how loud your German Shepherd barks. What
Yep.
did you say? He gets up to like 97 or 100 decibels.
Yeah, yep. 97 to 100, anywhere around in there. It's crazy.
So that's kind of interesting, kind of fun. Just goes to show how easy this app really is to use. You can use it anywhere. But the NIOSH Sound Level Meter app is free to download, can measure workplace noise to determine if workers are exposed to hazardous levels. It provides informational screens on hazardous noise levels, conducting noise measurements, selecting hearing protectors, and different hearing loss guidelines. Now, it is important to note that this is simply a tool for getting an idea of hazardous noise levels, but for an official noise survey, you definitely want to use equipment that, like Cindy said, can be calibrated, like a noise meter or a decimeter that we just talked about.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, using that only as a baseline and then using officially calibrated. Thanks for that reminder, Gina. I love that app. Like Gina said, I use it often just out of curiosity. I'll go downtown Main Street in the summer to bands, things like that. So it's just kind of interesting to see how different things affect you, or stand next to a railroad and see how that sounds. But now let's move into the audiometric testing. This basically is what's used to monitor employees' hearing over time. And as a side benefit, it gives employers the opportunity to educate your employees about their hearing and the importance of protecting it. So again, once it's damaged, you can't get it back, but we can prevent the damage. Now remember, if you have employees exposed to 85 decibels or more during that 8-hour time weighted average, you must establish and maintain an audiometric testing program. And that was part of what Gina was talking about earlier. What this includes is a baseline audiogram, annual audiograms, and follow-up procedures whenever those are applicable. Audiometric testing must be made available free of charge to all employees in your hearing conservation program. Okay, and audiometric tests must be conducted with calibrated audiometers that we just mentioned, just like the noise monitoring equipment has to be calibrated, in a room that also meets specific background noise levels that are established by ANSI. Now, you can find more information on room requirements in Appendix D to the standard, which again is 1910-95. So if you're interested, just take a look at Appendix D and that will show you what those rooms, what the requirements are. Also, a licensed or certified audiologist, otolaryngologist, or other physician must be responsible for the program. So that means that both professionals and trained technicians, they both may conduct audiometric testing, but the professional of the program is the one that has to be present when a qualified technician conducts the test or evaluates those tests. The professional's responsibilities include overseeing the program and the work of the technicians. They'll also review problem audiograms. Those are the ones that will help with the standard threshold shifts that we'll talk about, and determining whether referrals are necessary. So just some things to keep in mind there. Now, I'd like to dive into two different types of audiograms required in the hearing conservation program. We talked both about the baseline and the annual audiogram. So baseline audiograms are the reference audiograms. This is just a foundation. This is where your starting point, so to speak. They're very, very important because all future audiograms are going to be compared to these. OSHA does require employers to provide baseline audiograms within 6 months of an employee's first exposure at or above that 8-hour time-weighted average of 85 decibels. So 6 months prior, you need to do that. Now, there is an exception when mobile test vans are used for audiograms. In these instances, baseline audiograms must be completed within 1 year after the employee's first exposure. Okay, so that's just an exception that OSHA made. In the meantime, though, employees must be fitted with issued and required to wear hearing protectors whenever they're exposed to noise levels at that 8-hour time-weighted average for 85 decibels for any period exceeding 6 months. So from the difference between the baseline regular and the baseline in vans for the 6 months to 1 year, they have to have that protection in the meantime, okay? Because you don't want to inadvertently expose them to noise that is harmful. So it's important that employees refrain from exposure to workplace noise for 14 hours before you do a baseline. That's just to make sure that the tests aren't skewed in any way, making sure that you get accurate results. And this usually brings up another great question from our clients. Can employees still come to work prior to their test as long as they're wearing hearing protectors that to meet that 14-hour quiet time requirement? According to OSHA, they actually put out a letter of interpretation saying yes, and that interpretation basically says that you may substitute the use of hearing protection when the 14 hours of quiet time cannot be met. If temporary threshold shift contamination is a problem, then the retest, the audiogram should be preceded by 14 hours. So if you have to do a retest, then you would want to make sure that they do make that 14 hours prior. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit. We talked about baseline. Let's talk about the annual audiograms a little bit. These must be given within 1 year of the baseline audiogram. Okay, so not 366 days, but within a year. So a lot of people rotate, because the calendar year kind of rotates a little bit. So make sure that you're within that 1 year. It's important to test the worker's hearing every year because you want to catch any deterioration in their hearing ability as early as possible, because that early detection is what allows employers to begin those protective measures. The annual audiograms are then compared to the baseline audiograms for validity, and then also to determine whether or not the employee has experienced hearing loss or any standard threshold shift that we'll call from now on STSs. Many of you have heard of those. So again, very important that you do both the baseline and the annual audiograms. So I think now what we're going to do is I would like to throw up another poll, just because I'm curious if you're interested in accessing free resources and content on today's topic. You're in luck because JJ Keller's Compliance Network is sponsoring today's event, as we mentioned in the beginning. So we are going to offer a limited time access to all of the content and resources in that platform. This includes the regulations that we're talking about today, news and trending issues. We have FAQs that you can see. There's discussion forums, like I mentioned, and much more. So there's going to be a poll up on your screen. And if you would like to fill out that poll, let us know what you're interested in. And for those of you that do share what you're interested in, if you'd like complimentary access to this brand new online solution, we would also like to email you a copy of our white paper. It's titled Workplace Safety, Be Informed, Be Proactive, Be Compliant, just as a thank you again. So with that, I'm going to bounce back to Gina to explain those STSs in a little bit more detail. Gina?
Yes, thank you. STSs can cause some confusion, so let's break it down and take a closer look at what that means. So there are 3 key indicators that must exist for an STS, as shown here. An STS is an average shift in either ear of 10 decibels or more at 2,000, 3,000, and 4,000 hertz. Now, the image that you see here is what an STS would look like on paper. So you can take a look at that. But what really happens when the audiogram shows an STS? Employers must notify employees within 21 days after the determination that their audiometric test result shows an STS. So unless a physician determines that the STS is not work-related or aggravated by occupational exposure, the employer must take the following steps. Employees not using hearing protectors must be fitted with them, trained in their use, and required to use them. Employees already using hearing protectors must be refitted and retrained in the use of hearing protectors and provided with hearing protectors offering greater attenuation if necessary. So the employee must also be referred to a clinical audiological evaluation or an audiological examination as appropriate if an additional testing is necessary or if the employer suspects that a medical pathology of the ear is caused or aggravated by the wearing of hearing protectors. Now, the employee must also be informed of the need for an audiological examination if a medical pathology of the ear that is unrelated to the use of hearing protectors is suspected. Now, you can see exactly why it's important to seek advice and consultation from a physician because there's a lot of factors that come into play here. Now, if subsequent audiometric testing of an employee whose exposure to noise is less than the action level indicates that a standard threshold shift is not present, the employer shall inform the employee of the new audiometric interpretation and may discontinue the required use of hearing protectors for that employee. The audiometric program supervisor also may decide to revise the baseline audiogram if the employee's hearing improves. So this may happen in some instances after a period of rest or engineering controls have been implemented. Now, this revised baseline will ensure that actual hearing thresholds are reflected as closely as possible. The employer still must retain the original baseline audiogram for the length of the employee's employment. Now, referrals are made when test results are questionable or when related medical problems are suspected. Now, if additional testing is necessary, the employer must refer the employee for a clinical audiological evaluation or audiological exam as appropriate. Now, OSHA addresses some common employer questions on medical referrals in a letter of interpretation dated from June 2nd of 1998, and you can find that on their website, but I'll talk about a few of them as shown on the slide here. So, what constitutes a medical referral? The professional reviewer determines if an employee needs a medical referrer. So examples which might promote a referral are when an employee is unable to take a hearing test on a self-recording audiometer, it does not respond reliably or has visible irritation of the ear or pain in the ear canal, which may be caused or aggravated by earplugs. When is the company responsible for paying for the referral to a physician? Now, the employer is responsible for paying for referrals that are needed to accurately determine an employee's hearing status, or if it is suspected that the provided earplugs are causing the aggravation or irritation or infection of the employee's ear canals. Now, if the employer refuses to see a physician, what kind of documentation does the company need to prove that they offered the referral? So OSHA does not have any standard declination forms in the noise standard. Employers may use whatever documentation they prefer. You just have to document that, okay, we at least offered this. We educated the employee about their rights and about the OSHA requirements. If they decide to decline that, you just need to have some sort of documentation. Now, speaking of questions, Cindy, did you want to go over a few customer questions that we often receive?
I would love to, because I'm sure they might be in our Q&A feature right now. I'm not sure yet, but maybe we'll get to these ahead of time. So here are a few of our common questions that we get. First, we're often asked if temporary workers have to be tested when annual hearing tests are completed. If you're using a staffing agency to hire your temp workers, determining who's responsible for that annual hearing testing would be based on the contract, basically, you've both agreed to. Temporary employees that work for multiple host employers for short periods of time, like maybe less than a year, may be missed by your baseline and audiometric test program. So very important to get that written in the contract on who's doing what. In some of these cases, the staffing agency may be better positioned to meet the regulatory testing requirements. Again, it's determined by the contract between you and the staffing agency. Another question we often get is there a time frame for retesting an employee's hearing when there's an STS? Yes, if you choose to retest following an STS, it must be conducted within that 30-day time period. that the test revealed the standard threshold shift. So a retest would be considered valid if it was done in both years at the same time and place and within the 30 days. So we'll touch on this a little bit more on the next slide. So go into a little bit more detail. Finally, probably one of the most common concerns for employers is what if an employee refuses to take the test? Gina just addressed this for us. It requires basically employers who have hearing conservation program make those tests available to all affected employees at no cost. It does not require them to take the test. So she gave a little bit of information on that letter of interpretation. So remember, documentation is your friend on those situations for sure. Now, as we mentioned, OSHA does allow for retesting. If you retest their hearing within 30 days of the first test and the retest does not confirm the recordable shift, you're not required to record the hearing loss case on the OSHA log. However, if the retest confirms the recordable standard threshold shift, you must record the hearing loss within 7 calendar days of the retest. So then it would have to be added to the log if it comes back confirmed. Now, if subsequent audiometric testing performed under the testing requirements of the standard indicates that an STS is not persistent, you may erase or line out the recorded entry. You can learn more about the recording of STSs in 1904.10. That's the record keeping rule for OSHA, and we'll talk more briefly about it in a little bit too. But for now, I'm going to go back to Gina to cover some more common questions that we have. Gina?
Yes. So we are often asked if deaf individuals need to be included in audiometric testing. And in fact, this question, or at least a similar version of this question, has already been entered into the Q&A. So the answer to this might seem intuitive, but really it isn't. So this is a great question. OSHA explains in a letter of interpretation from August 3rd of 2004 that there is no exception for employees who have diminished capacity to hear for employees who have been diagnosed as deaf. So yes, you would treat them as any other employee for your hearing conservation program, including audiometric testing. Again, you have to offer it, but the employee may or may not choose to participate. So this brings up another question, which is how hearing aids should be treated in the workplace. So some employees want to use their hearing aids as hearing protection. And though this seems like it could be an acceptable practice, keep in mind that hearing aids are meant to amplify sound. So just as they amplify useful noise, hearing aids will also amplify unwanted or harmful noises, doing more harm than good. So hearing aids can be worn underneath an earmuff, but they cannot be used to replace hearing protection. Now, whoever is overseeing your hearing conservation program should be consulted to evaluate and manage these situations on a case-by-case basis. So we've talked about noise monitoring and testing. Now let's talk about noise control. It's always best to consider the hierarchy of controls when reviewing and implementing noise controls. Elimination, removing the hazard, and substitution, replacing the hazard with safer options, those are always going to be the most ideal solutions, but they're not always feasible. Engineering controls isolate hazards by changing the way products, tools, and processes are used. And then administrative controls, such as work rotations, alternate job procedures, and additional breaks should be used when engineering controls aren't an option or until they can be implemented. Now, hearing protection as a PPE, personal protective equipment, must be used when all other controls are not sufficient to reduce noise below the action level. So here are just a few examples of noise control measures. Modifying or replacing equipment, so purchasing and using low noise tools and machinery, maintaining and lubricating existing tools and machinery, installing sound barriers such as sound curtains or noise absorbing tiles, isolating or enclosing excessive noise producing equipment or machines. Those are all ways that you can modify or replace equipment. Now, if we're talking about changing or adjusting work schedules, you can limit how long workers can be exposed to loud machinery or tools. You can allow workers who are exposed to workplace noise sufficient breaks to sit in quieter areas. Now, what about changing or modifying work environments? Well, you could limit the operation of loud machinery to times when fewer workers are present. You could place distance between the worker and the loud machinery or tools if there's different ways that you can modify your environment. You can create quiet zones within the workplace where employees can give their ears a break. Now, let's go back to Cindy and discuss hearing protective devices.
Thanks, Gina. Yeah, we've talked about when hearing protection is required in the program. So let's talk about what types of devices there are. We like to call these HPDs, hearing protective devices, just because we love acronyms. Why not? They need to be free of charge, as we mentioned, to workers that are in the exposure zone. And the intent is to identify at-risk employees, right? And provide them with the protection that they need before they actually experience a loss. Because remember, you can't get it back. OSHA requires employees to wear hearing protectors for any period we talked about, 6 months from the time they are first exposed until they receive their baseline audiograms. If the tests are delayed, especially due to the mobile van testing, that's especially important to wear that. They also must wear them if they've incurred standard threshold shifts that demonstrate they're susceptible to noise, and if the employees are exposed to noise over that PEL of 90 decibels or over an 8-hour time-weighted average that Gina was sharing. Now, at a minimum, employers must provide employees with a selection of at least one variety of hearing plug and one variety of hearing muff. So the more offerings that you can give, the more apt that they're going to choose one that's comfortable, in which case they would wear, right? So, but make sure that those protectors that are selected are comfortable for the wearer, and they offer sufficient protection to prevent hearing loss. These protectors must be designed so that they adequately reduce the noise level for each employee's work environment. Most employers use the noise reduction system, or NRR rating. You'll see that on every box of hearing protectors pretty much. This represents the protector's ability to reduce noise under ideal laboratory conditions. Now notice I say ideal laboratory conditions. So our workplaces aren't ideal. So the NRR, it's going to help, you need to adjust for the NRR to reflect noise reduction in the actual working environment. And I'm going to show you an example of this on the next slide. So no worries there. Don't mean to start confusion there. Employers are required to reevaluate the suitability of the HPDs whenever there's a change in the working conditions, just like with anything else, right? Something changes, need to reevaluate their efficiency. So if the workplace noise levels increase, you need to provide more effective protectors, right? And require the use of those. And don't forget training, okay? Every time you change something or change an HPD, you really want to train those employees on how to use them and how to care for them. Because ultimately we just want them to be protected. So talked about the noise reduction rating, or the NRR. Again, this describes the average sound level reduction that HPDs provide. These ratings are really determined in laboratories that I mentioned in very controlled conditions. So they can't really possibly account for the variables that are found out there in the workplace. All HPDs are sold with an NRR, but you should know how to select the HPD that provides the best protection for any noise exposure at your workplace. So I've provided an example here on the slide on how to make that determination. And you can find more information again in Appendix B as in boy in the standard. Again, that's 1910-95 Appendix B boy. And so just again, just showing it out. We won't go through all the math, but again, you'll get a copy of the slides. You can go through this scenario and you can just see how you're subtracting your 7 decibels, which is predetermined from the NRR. So that math is there for you, and hopefully that will help you when you go to determine those. Again, and use the appendix as well. We often get quite a few questions about dual protection as well. So you're putting an earplug in and then putting a muff on top of that. OSHA standard doesn't specify when double hearing protection must be worn, but OSHA does allow the employer to determine if dual protection is appropriate in order to accommodate complicated environmental factors or HPD options, right? So dual hearing protection and NRR can be very, very tricky. So that's why I wanted to offer you another example here. So you'll have that when you get the copy of the slides. But first, it's important to remember when calculating NRR and hearing protection effectiveness, tests are only as good as a properly fitted and worn hearing protective device, right? You can have the best NRR and the best HPD, but if people aren't wearing it or they're not wearing them properly, it's not going to do us any good. The NRR for dual hearing protection, such as, like I mentioned, an earmuff on top of an earplug, it's really dependent on HPD selection. Again, just use this slide as a good way to calculate those. Again, more information can be found in that appendix, but also in OSHA's technical manual. So a couple different locations that you can use to get this information. And now I'm going to bounce it to Gina. I think we're going to start slowly wrapping things up, but we're going to go into training requirements first. Gina, is that right?
Yes, thank you, Cindy. Training, one of my favorite topics. So, employees who are part of the hearing conservation program must be trained on an annual basis. Training should be tailored specific to work environments and meet the needs of individual workers in educating them on hazards they may be exposed to, as well as the measures to be used to prevent or mitigate exposures to those hazards. So one example of tailoring noise training to specific workplace and workers is having a qualified personnel perform surveys in work areas to identify the hazards with high noise levels. And they can generate sound survey maps. Those maps can then be used to visually educate and train the workers regarding where their hearing protection is mandatory, and as a tool for identifying hotspots for potential noise controls. But training must essentially cover the effects of noise on hearing, the purpose, advantages, and disadvantages of various types of hearing protectors, the selection, fit, use, and care of protectors, and the purpose of audiometric testing and an explanation of test procedures. The training program may be structured in any format with different portions conducted by different individuals and at different times, as long as all of these required elements are covered. So it must be repeated annually for each employee in your hearing conservation program, and the information provided in the training program must be updated to be consistent with any changes in protective equipment and work processes. So you must also post a copy of the 1910.95 in the workplace and make it available to employees upon request. So in a letter of interpretation, OSHA says that employers are allowed to electronically post a copy of the standard, but only if the following conditions are met. The Employees Hearing Conservation Program training includes specific information to affected employees on where and how to access the noise standard electronically. So if you're going to post it digitally or electronically, you need to inform people where to access it and how to get there. The link provided to affected employees to access the OSHA noise standard electronically is not to a main web page such as the employer's website or OSHA's homepage, but directly to the OSHA noise standard. Now, computers are located within the affected employee's work area so that they have access to the noise standard without having to request access to a computer or ask for assistance retrieving the OSHA noise standard electronically. If those conditions are met, then yes, you can post this information digitally. Now let's talk about reporting. So 29 CFR 1904 requires workplace incidents and injuries to be recorded, reported, and evaluated for future corrective actions. Now, this includes events associated with occupational hearing loss. As with many incidents or injuries, the first step of reporting is determining work-relatedness. So this is probably the most asked question we receive regarding not just hearing loss, but any illness or injury. So to sum it up, the main components are work environment, caused, contributed to, or aggravates, and it has to be during work. So incidents are considered work-related if the event or exposure in the work environment either caused or contributed to the resulting condition or significantly aggravated a pre-existing condition. So incidents are also work-related when they occur during hours in which the employee is expected to be at work. So this includes normal working hours, paid and unpaid breaks included, and reasonable time before and after to arrive and leave the workplace. Now, OSHA has identified some unique exceptions that you can find listed on their website, again, under the 1904.5B2 standard. But back to STSs, if an employee's audiogram reveals that he or she has experienced a work-related standard threshold shift in hearing, either in one or both ears, and the employee's total hearing level is 25 decibels or more above the audiometric zero, which again is averaged at 2,000, 3,000, and 4,000 hertz, in the same ear as the shift, the standard threshold shift, you must record the case on the OSHA 300 log. Now, as a reminder, OSHA considered an STS to be a change in the hearing threshold relative to the baseline audiogram for that employee. So that's why baseline audiograms are so important. So again, it's an average of 10 decibels or more at the 2000, 3000, and 4000 hertz in one or both ears. So this definition can be found in paragraph G10I of the Occupational Noise Standard. You see that listed here on the slide. So that's where you can go to learn more about that specific requirement. But if the employee has never previously experienced a recordable hearing loss, you must compare the employee's current audiogram with that employee's baseline audiogram. If the employee has previously experienced a recordable hearing loss, you must compare the employee's current audiogram with the employee's revised baseline audiogram, which is the audiogram reflecting the employee's previous recordable hearing loss case. So anytime that there is a change or an STS, that becomes your new baseline, and you need to refer back to that for future audiograms. Now, OSHA does recognize as we age, our hearing may be affected. So when determining whether an STS has occurred, you may age adjust the employee's current audiogram results by using tables F1 or F2 in Appendix F of the 1910.95 standard as appropriate. So refer to that if that's a situation that you think that may be relevant to your work situation and your employees, because they do allow you to account for age. However, you may not use an age adjustment when determining whether an employee's total hearing level is 25 decibels or more above that audiometric zero. And again, that's all explained in that exception. So when you enter a recordable hearing loss case on the OSHA 300 log, you must check the 300 log column for hearing loss. And here's where you would record that hearing loss. So we often get asked about recordability of varying levels of loss. So for example, a hearing shift in both ears, would you count that as 2 recordable, 1 for each ear, or would that be a single recordable? Now remember, the key is when there is a shift of an average of 10 decibels or more in one or both ears, and the total hearing level is 25 decibels or greater above that audiometric zero in the same ears as the shift. So if the person has hearing loss or an STS, it would be 1 recordable. So very similar to if a person had an injury to both legs in a fall, it would still only be 1 recordable injury on your log. I know we're getting close on time, so I'm going to pass it back to Cindy, and we're going to talk about a couple more things, and then we'll have some time for questions.
Thank you, Gina, and hopefully you guys can hear me okay. I think my my audio went out there for a second, but just to talk a little bit about OSHA record keeping. You must keep noise exposure measurement records for 2 years and maintain records of audiometric test results for the duration of the affected employee's employment, okay? You can find more details again in paragraph M as in Mary of the standard 1910-95. These records required by the standard must be provided upon request to employees. So if they ask you for it, or former employees ask you, or representatives that are designated ask you for that, you do need to provide them a copy. To ensure you have all your ducks in a row, it's best to review your HCP, your hearing conservation program, and records every year. So just a good habit to get into to do that annual review. Now, the last component of your HCP, but certainly not the least, is the evaluation and follow-up. You want to make sure you review all components of your program to make sure you're not only compliant, but you're doing what you say you're going to be doing. And that's really what OSHA looks for. Are you doing what you say you're going to be doing? So make sure you have your noise surveys conducted, your risk assessments done, you have accounted for your temporary workers and whoever's exposed, you have your baseline and annual testing done, they're performed in a timely manner, you're monitoring threshold shifts, making sure that employees have access to the standard, the policies and procedures, training materials, and making sure that your program and your training is comprehensive and understandable to employees. So with that, we're going to talk a little bit too. I wanted to let you know another way to protect an employer's workers' hearing, but we want to also talk a little bit about the cost of not protecting your workers, right? This is where management and supervision really has to get down to the bottom line. It's not just about the workers' ears, even though that's most important, right? There are direct and indirect costs associated with that hearing loss. You can see some of these are listed on the screen. So really the goals of your hearing conservation program should be minimizing the impact of dangerous noise to employees, preventing risk to their hearing, maintaining timely audiometric testing, and identifying and eliminating noise exposures using those controls that Gina talked about earlier. And also, when you learn of something, expanding that to across the board to all your facilities, which most of you know is considered management of change, called MOC. But as goals are achieved, cost goes down, right? So it pays to have a hearing conservation program that suits the workplace and meets the needs of the workplace. There is a tool out there that OSHA has. It's called the OSHA Safety Pays. I love using this. It's an individual injury estimator. You can use it for anything, not just hearing conservation, but I like to throw it out there here because hearing can cost a lot of money down the road, right? It can even cost a lot of money for engineering controls and PPE, things like that. But the program may not provide a detailed analysis of an individual company's specific cost, but it does use a company's profit margin, average cost. So it's just a really cool tool to use to see what in fact it might cost you if you don't protect hearing of your workers. With that, let's go ahead and do just a quick summary to wrap things up a little bit. We've talked about hearing conservation program implementation, noise monitoring, control measures, testing, HPDs, even noise reduction ratings. We talked about a lot of stuff today. Hopefully we've clarified some regulatory requirements and best practices relating to hearing conservation and noise exposure in the workplace. And I think we're going to wrap it up with one more poll before we get into Q&A. Is that right, Gina?
Yes, we have one more poll that you should be seeing on your screen here. So if you are interested, please go ahead and indicate on that poll, again, topics that you're interested in. I think we have a handful of questions here that we'd like to get answered. I think we should just jump right into those.
Okay.
Cindy, do you have one that you wanted to get started with?
Yeah, let's see here. So I did have one question, I'm going to try to scroll up to the last one. If you provide hearing protection, earplugs, for example, several options. Sorry, I'm losing the show. At no cost to the employee, but they want molded ones. Can the company say that they have those, but they would not pay out of pocket for that option? Or does that option need to be provided at no cost, even though we already have a selection appropriate for the noise hazard? This is a really great question because it comes up quite often. You don't have to specifically pay for specially molded hearing protection. If, however, there was a circumstance where they did do a medical referral and there is some sort of a medical reason that they can't use the plugs or they can't use a different form of hearing protection that would be effective according to the medical referral, you may want to consider paying for that. But otherwise, OSHA just requires you to offer hearing protection in a variety of forms. So most people will offer that to certain employees. Gina, do you have a good question? That was a really great question.
Yeah. So somebody had asked when double PPE is used, what to use for the NRR rating. So if you're using both earplugs and earmuffs for that dual protection. We can't really get into it right now because there is actually a calculation that you need to use. It's not as simple as, just adding up the two NRR ratings and figuring it out from there. But OSHA does have on their website a calculation that you can use to determine the NRR rating when you're using dual protection. So you'll definitely want to go check that out.
Very good. I have one here. How does program facilitate better understanding and communication for individuals who already have hearing difficulties? Another good question on that. And Gina did talk a little bit about that earlier. We do have to treat deaf and hearing impaired individuals equally, but it is maybe a challenge to help with sharing the information back with them. There are resources out there for interpreters that are usually publicly provided, or the deaf or hearing impaired individual may have access to that as well. Through medical programs of their own. So utilize those resources if you're having difficulty sharing the information or helping them understand or communicate with those people. But great question. You do want to make them understand that they are part of your program, right? Equally so. Gina, back to you.
Yeah, so Valerie's wondering if records of hearing testing can be kept with employee medical records at HR. It really, OSHA doesn't dictate, where you keep your records, just as long as you have those records on file. But keep in mind that if OSHA comes on site to do any sort of audit or investigation, they may ask to see those records. So you just need to have them readily accessible. But you certainly could keep those with HR because there is, potentially sensitive medical data in there. So that's a good question.
Very good question. And I do have a couple here that are back to back, so I'll hit both of these at once. Andrew was asking, what does OSHA mean by selection? So what they're talking about is you want to have choices, right? You want to have choices of moldable hearing protectors, the plugs that go in your ears. You want to have some that are maybe on the cords. You may want to have some that look like the headsets that we wear. You want to have earmuffs as an option for people that don't want to put something inside their ears. Either their ears are sensitive or it's painful to wear those earplugs. I know I'm one of those people. Once in a while, some of those just hurt my ears, so I'd rather wear earmuffs. So just a selection or a variety. That's all they're meaning there by selection, Andrew. Great question. Another one was, how would you measure exposure levels when employees are flying in a small aircraft to a remote backcountry airstrip? The aircraft and conditions are different on most flights. Yep, that's exactly true, which is why we talked about the difference between using dosimeters, personal monitors, or the sound meters. That might be a situation where it might be best to use a personal monitor that attaches right to the individual person, because that's going to capture that 8-hour time weighted average of when they're on the tarmac, when they're loading baggage, when they're inside the cockpit and it's maybe quieter, when there are wind gusts and things like that, or turbulence. So probably best to use a personal monitor in those situations, just so you capture the variety of the actual person's experience and exposure. Really, really good question. Appreciate that. Gina, I think we might have time for one more.
Yes. Did you see this question here, Cindy, on what to do if your baseline program is not within the OSHA required timeline? Do you have more insight on that?
I do. So OSHA understands that they obviously expect compliance with the regulatory requirements, which is to have that within the 6 months or 1 year if you have the hearing van. If for some reason there was an employee that has slipped through the cracks, I know that it's important that you get them immediately tested, and it would be best to explain that ahead of time, be proactive, let OSHA know what your situation is, and then get that audio, the baseline started right away so that you can get them in rotation for the annual audiogram. So unfortunately, you don't want to miss people like that because that could be a non-compliance. So just make sure that you're catching them up to speed ASAP. And like I said, explain it to OSHA, have documentation. Trust me, documentation when it comes to hearing conservation is your friend. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Kevin.
All righty. Well, yes, no, excellent. Great job to you both. As you indicated, you covered a lot of ground and very thorough, lots of things for folks today. So once more, thanks for sharing your insights and expertise. With the Q&A, no, we covered a lot of ground there too, but don't worry, if you had an unanswered question, that'll be forwarded along to today's speakers. And just once more, a reminder, shortly after we conclude today, there'll be that evaluation survey that we're asking you to complete, and it'll open in a different screen after the webinar. And we truly appreciate your input as it helps us improve our future webcasts. As we wind down today, once again, sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but those will be forwarded along to our speakers. Know about the survey that's coming your way, and all that's left really is just to end the webcast. And once more to thank Cindy Pauley, Gina Godine, everyone at JJ Keller, and all of you who listened in. Thank you and have a great day.